I'm Konstantina Zanou. I am an associate professor of Italian and Mediterranean history here at Columbia University in the Italian department. And this series of events, the Italian and Mediterranean colloquia, they have been going on for almost 10 years now. And they are always sponsored by the Italian department and co-sponsored by the European Institute, which we thank very much. So today we have with us Andreas Guidi, and I'm very happy for that. Let me tell you a few words about Andreas. So Andreas is an associate professor at the Institut National de Langue et Civilisation Orientale, INALCO, in Paris. He obtained his PhD from the Humboldt University in Berlin and the École des études anciennes sociales in Paris. Before moving to the INALCO, Andreas was a postdoc researcher at the University of Constance and a visiting fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. His research interests include the history of the modern Mediterranean and the history of the Balkans, especially the history of imperialism, colonialism, and fascism, as well as the history of youth and generations. He investigated these fields with a study on Rhodes in his first book, Generations of Empire, Youth from Ottoman to Italian Rule in the Mediterranean, published by University of Toronto Press in 2022, which is actually the book we're presenting today. Andreas is currently working on a second book project on the history of illicit trade in the 20th century Mediterranean, and we look forward also to that. Let me just add for Italian speakers here that he has also recently published an interesting article on the different ways scholars of Italian history engage with the Mediterranean, titled Storia Italiana, Storia Mediterranea, Nuove prospettive in su un passato imperiale e coloniale. It was published in Italia Contemporanea, and I will put in the chat the links to both the article and the book. So let me just say a word about the format of the event today. Andreas will be opening the conversation with a 15-minute talk on his book. Then I will pose some questions to which he will be able to answer before we open the floor to the public. The event will not last for more than 1 hour and 15 minutes. So, Andreas, let me start by first thanking you for being here, and second, congratulating you on your book. This is a very important work, which changes the frame by which we think of Italian colonialism in the Mediterranean. It places emphasis on continuities rather than ruptures, and by doing so, it actually sees Italian colonialism as a post-Ottoman phenomenon and tells a history about, which is also about the Greek and the Jewish Mediterraneans. So can you walk us through this work and explain to those who have not read it what the book is about?
I will try. And first of all, let me thank you, of course, Konstantina, for inviting me. It's so great to be able to talk about my book in this wonderful Italian and Mediterranean colloquium. It would have been even more lovely, of course, for me to be there with you in New York. But I'm also happy to see many friends from both sides of the Atlantic in their tiny picture on my screen. So I prepared a very basic presentation that I will now share. I hope you can all see it. And in the 15 minutes that I have available, I will just, try to make you a bit more familiar with the setting of my story, and then say a few words about what I think are the 4 main contributions of the book, and then maybe introduce very briefly the content of its 5 central chapters. So to begin with, here you can see a map of the Eastern Mediterranean right before the beginning of the Italian occupation of Rhodes on the left. These group of islands that were part of an Ottoman province, and Rhodes was the provincial center of this Ottoman vilayet called Vilayet of the Archipelago. And this is the point of departure for my study, because it's a story of how this center of an Ottoman province became the center of an Italian territory that was not officially called a colony, but rather a possedimento, so something like a possession, known as the Dodecanese, but officially as the Italian Aegean Islands, Possedimento delle Isole Italiane dell'Egeo. And you can see in the other map the islands that were part of this territory. I focused mainly on the urban setting of Rhodes town, not even Rhodes as an island. And you can see another picture on the right. I mean, it's rather small, but maybe you can have a glimpse of the background where you can see parts of the walled city. And so also many monuments dating back to the Ottoman period. And then also more modern buildings that were built later during Ottoman rule. Rhodes was a middle-sized town for both Ottoman and Italian standards, hosting around 15,000 inhabitants around 1912, and then growing to more or less 25,000 in the 20s and 30s. Even for the standards of an Ottoman town, the proportion between the confessional groups in Rhodes was rather balanced. So we have Muslims, Jews, Greek Orthodox, or Rumlar in Ottoman, and a few. So all these groups amounted to a few thousands. And this proportion was preserved at least until World War II, whereas you also have some Catholic families, a few hundreds, and the Catholic population then grew after the arrival of Italians to a few thousands as well. There are maybe 3 dates that you can pinpoint to just sum up this story. So 1912 is the beginning of Italian occupation that happened in the framework of this larger conflict between Italy and the Ottoman Empire of 1911-1912. And this military occupation lasted for 11 years until the Treaty of Lausanne. That was maybe the last of this series of treaty at the end of World War I, that basically assigned the islands to Italy and thus recognized Italian sovereignty internationally. And this is also the moment when we shift from a military administration to a civil administration of these islands, with the governor of Rhodes directly linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. So interestingly, not to the Ministry of the Colonies, as it was the case for other territories in Africa. And then the Italian rule on the island evolved from the 1920s to the 30s, but it's important to remind you that it continued until World War II, until 1943, where you have, you know, the arrival also of German troops after the collapse of Mussolini's regime at the national level. And so you have this co-presence of Germans and Italians on the island that also leads to the deportation of the Jewish community, a very dramatic rupture in the history of Rhodes. And then, you know, the end of Italian rule dates to the end of World War II, with 2 years of British military administration and then annexation by Greece in 1947. This is basically the chronological frame of my study. Now, moving to the 4 objectives of the book very briefly. The first one is what I call a change in framing the history of Italian colonialism, but of course we could apply this to European colonialism more in general for the Eastern Mediterranean context, as post-Ottoman history. So also because of the way I was trained in, you know, studying Southeast European history and this whole debate about transition from empire to nation states, I thought that the case of Rhodes was interesting because you see a transformation from empire to empire that we can approach, you know, beyond this very clear rupture of sovereignty. So my story does not begin in 1912, but it also includes developments of the late Ottoman era. And it's also a way to create a dialogue between, again, Mediterranean studies, Italian studies, Ottoman studies, Southeast European history, and so on. The second contribution is more a question of scale, because I tried, so it started in a way as a very local history of Rhodes, but by following both institutions and actors, I realized that they both moved in a much more complex and large space. And so I decided to highlight this this basically interplay between the local, the imperial, and the regional scales. This also helped me, going beyond just a reading of Italian colonialism and fascism as only a state-driven project, that we subsume under this term Mare Nostrum, and to actually retrieve the plurality of political references that we can observe in the Mediterranean in that period. And then there is a question of, how to approach imperial rule as such. And I opted for this basically concept of interaction between state institutions, communal institutions, and local families. And so I tried to study the political change from empire to empire through these relationships between the state, the communities, and the families. This is important because given the diversity of the population of Rhodes, it also helped me, go beyond one single community. I try to include families of all confessions, and to highlight how the political transformations, in plural, of course, created some common challenges that affected Muslims, Jews, Orthodox, and so on, but also it could produce different responses to the same challenge. And fourthly and lastly, something that is very important, is in the title of the book. I try to read all this through a focus on the concepts of generation and youth. Why? Because first of all, it allowed me to introduce a different temporality, so we don't have only a change in ruling structures from one empire to the next, but also different generations of the same families and how they experience this change. But beyond that, again, to make a reference to how the research started, at first I thought about writing a history that would be something like from young Turks to Balilla, But I rapidly realized that it would be more interesting to, again, go beyond this official state-driven discourse on youth and the indoctrination on youth, and to look at how other voices, again, local families, newspapers, associations, and communities use this term. And I realized that they use both the term generation and youth to describe and to make sense of both political, social, cultural, and economic change in this period. So it's a more plural, let's say, approach that does not essentialize one given generation or an homogeneous group called youth. Now, to the 5 central chapters of the book, maybe, the first one to begin with relates to politics, and I think it's helpful to the reader because, you have at least the main political topics exposed in this first chapter. And the trajectory that I try to describe is this shift that happens through several phases, from what I call a juvenilization of politics in the late Ottoman period, meaning that, for example, there is a circulation of elites, so younger actors have access to politics, and also there is this inception of a discourse on youth and on a new political generation. But for example, teenagers are rather excluded from the political stage. And then you can see that, especially in the 1910s and 20s, local youth is considered more and more as a sort of political force, in most cases as troublemakers. But in this phase, they are still considered to be under the influence of elders. An important phase happens later in the 1930s, and it relates to the picture that you see here. It's a group of local Jews that were part of a faction of the Zionist revisionist movement that we can discuss maybe later. Together with other political groups, they represented a sort of danger for Italian imperial authorities because the politicization of youth itself, and this is the last part of this trajectory, basically, was something that was considered basically the emergence of a political force outside the control of the authorities. So every form of spontaneous, let's say, politicization of youth in Rhodes came to be seen as a danger as soon as it went beyond the structures of the fascist party in the 1930s. Now, to the second chapter that is dedicated to family. Of course, family itself is a very broad and fluid category. You have households, kinship, relationships, and bonds. And I try to make sense of this complexity. For example, here in the picture, you see what is called a family portrait, but very easily, then if you follow the identity of each person, you see that some neighbors were also part of this picture. Some members of the family were elsewhere because they had emigrated. So it's a complex object to study, a family as a whole. But I insisted on family building because, again, we can really see how generational dynamics are important to explain changes in the family. And also because there is a change in the relationship between families and the state. So the point I wanted to make is that from Ottoman to the Italian period, you really have an increasing pressure on the side of state authorities and institutions that reaches into the domestic sphere. And what is interesting is also that if you look at petitions from mostly poor families to the local governors, you see that increasingly, and then culminating in the 1930s, these petitions really show a kind of convergence in the language between what was considered to be the fate of the state, so the fate of the fascist empire, and the fate of the individual family. So basically, the families themselves appropriated the political language and talked themselves about the new generation or a youth that was to be loyal to fascism, for example. Another chapter deals with education, of course, a usual subject in the histories of youth. What I try to highlight is that the educational landscape was very diverse already in Ottoman times. So the foundation of new, especially secondary schools, you have missionaries. As you can see here, a picture from the missionary school that was then turned into an Italian state school. You also have schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, mostly, but not only for Jews, Ottoman state schools. And so I wanted to show that each institution had its own agenda, but the agenda also came from outside. So from how state authorities tried to mold and to relate to these school institutions. For example, how the Italians, again, changed the personnel, the teaching language, and so on. And in the end, I realized that there is again a convergence between the idea of students and the virtuous image of youth. So youth as students as a result of this convergence. Then the fourth chapter is the only one that basically deals with apparently two topics at the same time, with work and leisure. Because I realized that in the sources that I looked at, and that I can describe more in detail later on, both fields are basically dealt with together. The police or school institutions, for example, talk about the future of their pupils, in terms of both professional activities, but also the use of free time. And I also realized through this chapter that we can add the layer of class, different classes involved in this process, and also a gender dimension, because this idea that, a regulation of time management was needed applied differently to boys and girls. So for boys, it was more about productivity and the use of money, for example, whereas for girls, it related more to the body, to morality, and to sexuality. And one last chapter is about mobility. It was probably the favorite one for me as a writer, because there you can really follow very diverse trajectories of both people arriving in Rhodes and leaving Rhodes to faraway destinations. So I try to divide the chapters in two parts, and in the first one, I look at how emigrants already living during the Ottoman period, had to basically reinvent belonging to a community, because communities as formal institutions did not really exist in America, for example. So they preserved but also transformed this idea of communal belonging. Whereas in the second part, I look at how Italian-speaking immigrants who came from Italy, but not only, I also talk about, for example, those who arrived from former Ottoman cities like Smyrna, were integrated into this imperial project of reinforcing, let's say, the Italianità, the Italian element in Rhodes. And you can see here in this picture a family that arrived from Smyrna, again, different generations, and the younger generation really embodies this idea that, you know, in order to be a good Italian, you also need to be a good fascist. I think I can stop here because we will hopefully have many things to discuss until the end of our event. So I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. If you can stop sharing, it would be great. Wonderful. So, first of all, beautiful. I am very excited that your favorite chapter was also my favorite chapter from your book. Not that I didn't like the others, but perhaps since we have both a favorite chapter, we can start from that. Because I'm very much interested in this idea of Rhodes as a mobile space, not only Rhodes, but also, you know, you seem to be discussing these imperial spaces in general, and by consequence, you know, what Italy, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, all these entities somehow, and even communities themselves, by shifting scales all the time and mixing different belongings, you seem to understand all your pieces, let's say, or your tools as tools which are mobile and in the shaping constantly. So I wanted to invite you to talk more here about the different forms of mobility that shaped your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think more in general, and this is something that does not only apply to the Mediterranean, but to other imperial spaces, the end of empire, let's say, or the post-imperial world is really informed by migration in different directions. So it would be very limiting, let's say, to just look at local settings according to those who stayed or those who arrived. It's really also a story about those who had left. And this already happened in Ottoman times. So again, it's a perfect subject to include both periods, let's say, but also, again, to see that if you start to follow individual and family trajectories, then they, for example, experience this political change and rupture of 1912 or 1923 while not being in Rhodes yet or anymore. So this is why in the first part of the chapter, I focused on the emigration of Jews and Greeks from Rhodes, because what is interesting is that this first wave of emigration started right after the Young Turk Revolution, a very important moment in Ottoman history, 1908. And, you know, in many cases, these two groups, Jews and Greeks, they left together. They were on the same boat. And even after arriving in the US, the first steps in the new continent, in the new country, were taken together. But precisely because a part of, you know, migration stories are about referring back to older communal belongings and so on, the result is that nowadays, for example, the memory of this emigration is clearly separate, the Greek and the Jews and the Jewish one from Rhodes. So I tried to reconstruct the story in these early steps and see how making a community abroad was something that really contributed to this separation of memory, starting from a very close experience of the journey and, you know, making a living in faraway destinations. It's basically symmetric when we shift to the inflow of Italian speakers toward Rhodes. because the idea was to see how people with very different backgrounds, the Ottoman, Levantine, let's say, background, were supposed to merge with immigrants, for example, from southern Italy. So instead of having this, communal belonging as the reference that I investigated, I took examples of families from Smyrna and from southern Italy to see how they coped with this new idea of national and imperial belonging at the same time. So it's also a way to, again, play with different temporalities and to insist on the fact that all that I just described, so also the transmission of memory of migration and this transmission of values happens through generational dynamics. So it's not just about the story of those who move, but also their descendants, and that was really interesting to investigate.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and also I like the idea that all these different trajectories are narrated through different traditions, which are separate, and somehow you bring them together back to their point of departure, which is Rhodes, or their point of arrival, which I really like as an idea. Well, since you mentioned the generational thing, my second question is about the concept, the notion of generation that you put in your title, you put center stage in your book. So I appreciate this notion as a space of projection of political projects, or anything that the state somehow, wanted to project to the future, would invest on the idea, on the notion of the youth. So I wanted to ask you how this notion was useful to you, and why you place it center stage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, because it also allows me to tell you a bit about how the book idea came into being in the first place, because at first, again, I picked this setting because it was a nice intersection of Italian, Ottoman, and Southeast European history. But then I found a source containing a statement by the civil governor of Rhodes in the 1920s and 30s, Mario Lago, who had a very long tenure for the standard of colonial governors, in which it was, I think, in 1929, he really insisted on his project of creating a new generation that was supposed, to have basically a local and loyal youth. So obedient colonial subjects that would at the same time stay in Rhodes and respect the hierarchy that saw Italians and Italianness as superior compared to the local population. Then I realized actually that, and I'm writing an article right now about a much broader history of this term, new generations for empire, because I realized that, in the Romanovs, so the Russian Empire, but also in the Habsburg Empire, the years, the very last years of these empires, like in the Ottoman case, are already marked by this discourse on, political renewal through the invention of a new generation. And this is something very interesting. But then, this was kind of the point of departure, because then I also started to reflect about how we use this notion in history and in the social sciences. And very frequently, we refer back to works, for example, by Karl Mannheim, The Problem of Generations. And, I realized that it's not a coincidence that Mannheim wrote this very famous chapter, basically, in 1928. So also in the same historical moment. So generations really started to matter as also a political phenomenon around this time. But then again, I also try to apply this term to other phenomena. For example, how when we approach the family, generations apply to generational dynamics. That is, again, the relationship between parents and children, and also the transmission of resources, right? What we inherit from our parents and what we leave to our children, if we have any, of course. And then, you know, another thing is something in between. So something between political projects about creating new generations and this rather analytical tool to describe dynamics within the family. This middle ground, you can find it in all the fields that I described in the chapters, at school, in terms of work and leisure, in the dynamics of mobility, because even beyond the domestic sphere, the household, basically, the term generation, or the idea of generational dynamics, is very much present. You know, teachers talk a lot about generations, of course. For example, those who found sport clubs, the part of the chapter on work and leisure is about football, also a novelty of that time. And they also have their own ideas about generations and youth. So I really try to use it in a rather plural way, merging political visions, everyday experiences, and you know, also question of roles and resources. That's how I came to use it.
Thank you, Andreas. This is wonderful. And it's something that you do with several concepts in the book, that you use them in different scales, and I really appreciated that. I already see two very interesting questions in the chat, and as I have a couple of more questions for Andreas, I would invite you to continue writing your questions. I will address them later, and I will give the word to those who want to speak. But let me just, since we have time, I will just pose a couple of more questions to you. So I am wondering, you know, you already talked about the Mediterranean dimension in this story, but I want to, since this is an Italian and Mediterranean colloquium, and since I am thinking very much about these issues, I wanted you to tell us more about what the Mediterranean context does, what it brings to your story, as an analytical framework. How does it help us understand this such a local story of passage from from one empire to another?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in this basically trans-imperial history that I try to tell, the Mediterranean is for sure more important to the post-Ottoman, let's say, trajectory of the Italian Empire than to the Ottoman Empire itself. So I will focus on the Italian period. And I think the main interest in using, you know, or in highlighting at least this Mediterranean dimension is that when we usually write the history of fascism and, you know, fascist imperialism, we tend to project the vision of, you know, the Mare Nostrum onto the Mediterranean, you know. And it's very difficult to move beyond this discursive level, because it's a political project, and as such, of course, you know, it has its own semantics, its own vision, but also its own limits. And I try to do the other way around, so basically to see what the plurality of the Mediterranean space, also in terms of political references, does to this imperialist project. So in a way, it's an attempt to tackle usual histories of the Mare Nostrum project. I mentioned the plurality of political references, and this is something that, again, is very closely connected to the experience of youth, because, so first of all, the Italian fascist rule in Rhodes was part of this competition, you know, between Italy and other imperial powers of the Mediterranean, like the French and the British empires, of course. And my colleague Alexis Rappas, for example, has an ongoing comparative research on that also includes Cyprus, for example, under British rule, or the mandates in Syria and Lebanon under French rule in the same period. So this is already a level of analysis, but I didn't really focus on that. But then there is the whole circulation of political movements in the Mediterranean in the early 20th century. So we have, for example, Greek nationalism that has its own almost imperial agenda, one could say. And then there is, for example, the emergence of Kemalism in Turkey, only a few miles away from Rhodes. And then other movements like Zionism. They are all, in a way, post-Ottoman because they move in through these territorial changes that result from the end of the Ottoman Empire. You know, Greek nationalism is not the same after 1919 or 1923, where it's basically, you know, there is the whole demise of this Megali Idea project. But this all, again, as I said, intersects with the experience of the local youth because all the movements I mentioned attracted a part of youngsters of the young population in Rhodes. So, for example, the Italian police is closely surveilling, you know, all the links between the Turkish consul and Muslim youth, precisely because for the Italians, for example, it was more, let's say, convenient to keep on talking about Muslims and not to talk about Turks, to raise not to raise this question of Turkish minority, you know. But the Turkish consul insisted on this Turkish identification, and you see some cases where local youth really become attracted by Turkish nationalism. The same happens with, you know, the kind of enosis movement that also applies. So the unification with Greece, again, a claim of Greek irredentism that you can find in Rhodes, but also, you know, in communities of Dodecanesian descendants in Egypt. And this is another example. For Zionism, the story is even more interesting because at first, those who identified with this wing of Zionism under, let's say, the guidance of Vladimir Jabotinsky, so a more aggressive stance against the British mandate in Palestine, for example, at first they claimed that, you know, they could be at the same time loyal Zionists and loyal fascists and at the same time Jews and Italians. So you would expect that the governor, you know, was actually saw this as a very favorable turn. But the very fact that the movement was not orchestrated from above, but came from the youth itself, then represented the danger. And this is why, you know, these are different examples of how looking beyond the scheme of Italian imperialism that has a very strong Mediterranean dimension can help us, again, highlight the plurality of references. So it's not just a Mediterranean story, of course, but because through emigration, you see that some circulations and changes are even more profound and broader. But I think it's an interesting way to look at Italian imperialism from a less exclusive, let's say, perspective.
That's beautiful. And my final question connects to this. So I think, yeah, you already answered one of the questions in the chat by Haris Psaltis, who is a fellow Cypriot and a professor of sociology and psychology in Cyprus, and he was asking about nationalism and the Megali Idea, and I think here you answered. But my final question connects to this, to some things. First, my quality as a Cypriot. Second, the fact that I wrote a book about the Ionian Islands and they're passing from one empire to other empires and nation states, and also to my future project of writing an island history of the modern Mediterranean. So, you know, I want to ask you basically about Rhodes, the quality of Rhodes as an island. What does this? What does it do? What the insularity of Rhodes does in the story? One question is this, and the other, which you don't, of course, you don't do, but you hint to, and it made me think a lot about equivalent stories in other islands. Say, In Cyprus, for example, it was the British policy exactly the same as the Italian policy of keeping the Ottoman structure of communities and organize the state around the Turkish and the Muslim and the Christian community, let's say, in the same way. And many other things that I found in your book, which are equivalent, very similar to what was happening in the transition in the Ionian Islands. So I think there is something to be said there. You don't have to do this, but I want us to think together how the story changes if we tell these stories by comparing islands with other islands, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very interesting question and also a very fascinating project you have. And it resonates also in what I have read again in Alexis Rapas's work on, you know, this links even between governors of Cyprus and Rhodes. First of all, I mean, insularity matters a lot, but I think the case of the Dodecanese also recommends that we are a bit careful with using insularity as a category for all islands, because if we move from Rhodes, for example, to most of the minor islands that I showed in the map previously, you can really see that, for example, the demography is very different. Like most of the other islands were almost exclusively inhabited by Greek Orthodox. So I decided to really focus on Rhodes precisely to keep this, you know, the question of confessional diversity in the picture. It would have been a different kind of book if I had, you know, really inserted stories from the minor islands in the foreground. But insularity matters in general if you see islands also as a resource for imperial power. And again, I think this applies not only to the post-Ottoman setting, but also to the late Ottoman setting. For example, the island of Rhodes, more than the other minor islands, was used by the Ottomans as a place for political exile or banishment, more correctly, because it was within the Ottoman territory, the practice of the sürgün. In Ottoman tradition, you could send, you know, dissident intellectuals, leaders of local revolts from throughout the empire. You know, many intellectuals of the 19th century spent a few months or years in Rhodes. For the Italians, I mean, this changes, but the insularity aspect remains important, first of all, because these islands become a borderland. That was not the case, you know, at least to the same extent until the 1910s. And so the challenge is to manage a population that in many cases, and this applies to people of all confessions, apart from the Greeks who are expelled from Anatolia, of course, but many Muslims and Jews kept bonds across the sea, you know, with Anatolia. So land, properties, and just, you know, kinship ties. And for the Italians, of course, this becomes a problem because it creates ambiguity in juridical terms, in terms of, you know, circulation of goods between the legal and the illegal sphere. And so this represents a problem, the insularity of Rhodes. But since it is a borderland, you can see basically the opposite phenomenon. So all the discontents of Italian rule, at least those who represent for the authorities a more immediate danger, are sent from Rhodes to other islands or even to the Italian kingdom. So, for example, there is this very interesting story about a young Muslim, again, one that entered the orbit of Kemalism, that was then arrested and sent as a, you know, as a form of political banishment to a very small village in Basilicata that is only a few kilometers away from Agliano, so Gagliano, where Carlo Levi set his book, Cristo si è fermato a deboli. And you can see again that the kind of metropolitan, the colonial, the imperial, and the regional framework somehow collide when you start to tell this story that, you know, really follow the individual's trajectory.
That's wonderful. Let me open to the questions of the public. We already have some some questions here, but I would ask anyone or to write or raise their hand if they want to ask something. But since you mentioned that, I will ask you in the individual trajectories. I will start from this question about by Osvaldo Rodriguez, who asks if there is a memoir or memoirs you can, from those migrants, from those mobilities, that you can that tell us about this experience. And also let me add here that I'm teaching a class on biography and microhistory, and I have my students here. Again, such sources will be wonderful, especially less studied sources that could help, also students approach the subject through this.
Yeah, I mean, there are many. It's an excellent question again, because it also relates to the question of sources. There are both memoirs and oral histories, and I use them a lot for the chapter on mobility, but not only, because then, for example, we have some examples of memoirs written by those who survived the Holocaust. And a very famous book is by Stella Levy, originally from Rhodes. I think it's called 100 Saturdays or 100 Saturdays. It came out a few months ago, and it's definitely very interesting. Because,
oh, great. Matteo, did you hear that? I have a student who works on this, and I hope he talks later on.
I think this will have, a very broad diffusion, but the first examples of memoirs had been published already in the 1970s. So it took some time after the Holocaust to make sense of, this origin from this corner of the Mediterranean, but then we have a growing production. And also, I think Dario Miccoli is working on the Jewish diaspora, and I think he will also talk in this.
We will present his book in the first event of the next semester.
What is interesting is that it's not just a part of the memorialization of the Jewish experience, because you also have some memoirs in Turkish that I used, and there is a common thread spanning through these works, is that each author really concentrates on his or her own community, which makes sense. I mean, especially when you're facing these large-scale wounds and that never heal, like the Holocaust, of course, it's important to recenter the community. But for me, when trying to put the pieces together, I try to, again, for example, use what I found in police archives, sometimes related to the same people who then wrote the memoirs, and this is a very nice intersection, because you have another perspective. I mean, of course, there's the whole discussion about, for example, oral histories recorded decades later. They tend to silence a lot of, everyday situations that you see in contemporary sources from the 1920s and 1930s. But I would say that, apart from that, like reading a good memoir on the past, it always opens so many gates to how we approach, histories. So it's always a very nice way to enter a subject and then discover more, for example.
Yes, totally. And also I was very fascinated by, but I won't ask another question, just in case people want to know about that, about the archives of the Carabinieri that you have seen. And also, I think Chris Mingo is here, who was interested in, you have some interesting observations on the different uses of the military and meanings of military in the youth from one empire to another, and that I also found very useful. So, but let me go to David Shah's question, which is about it's about the exchange of populations in the 20th century. How did that really very dramatic event affect Rhodes and the administration there, the Italian administration?
Thank you very much, David, for this question that I didn't really approach, although I mentioned the Treaty of Lausanne, because indeed settling the Dodecanese legal status was part of the discussion at the same Lausanne conference. So indeed, the reason why this confessional diversity was preserved, at least until the deportation of Jews in 1944, is precisely because the former Ottoman subjects who remain in the Dodecanese under Italian administration were not exposed to this, forced displacement. But although I describe Rhodes as sort of hurricane's eye, in a very violent history of displacement, genocidal policies in Anatolia, the First World War, for example, was not very, it didn't have a massive impact in terms of fights or battles, but this all, of course, changed the post-war setting. So on the one hand, you have some communities, for example, from the nowadays towns of Fethiye and Kayaköy in Turkey that were called back then Makri and Livisi, who arrived in Rhodes in the days just after the Great Fire of Smyrna, so in September 22. And then they did not move on to Greece. They decided to remain in Rhodes and became Italian Aegean subject. That was the juridical category that was distinguished from, full citizenship. Another interesting thing is everything that relates to citizenship, again, because the Treaty of Lausanne also laid the foundations for this distinction between the so-called renicoli, so those in Rhodes who could prove to, have the full Italian citizenship, for example, in most cases, because they came directly from the kingdom, so from northern or southern Italy. And the locals who had this second-class legal status. The deal was basically to use this discourse on respect for the autonomy of the Ottoman community, so to preserve these communities, to ask loyalty and obedience in return. But in the end, although in the 1930s there were some attempts to introduce full citizenships to those who were ready to volunteer in the Italian army, a question that I approach in the book because, again, it applies to youth, young men. But that concerns, in the end, only a few dozens. There was no overarching idea that the full Italian citizenship should be accorded to the whole population of the Dodecanese. So there is definitely a long echo of the Lausanne Treaty and this exchange of population, although it did not directly affect the population of Rhodes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I'm going to another question by Haris Psaltis again. So he says, in sociology and social psychology, we discussed the work of Mannheim on generations and more recently cohort effects. I have no idea what this is, so you will know. And so he asks, can you give us, please, the cohort effect you identified in this transition? I haven't read Mannheim, you can see, so, but you can speak.
I mean, I guess I know more or less. It's basically an approach where you select those born in a time span of, let's say, 1 or 5 or 10 years. It could be cohorts in plural. And then you try to study their experience of history at a given point in time. So, for example, different experiences of communism in Bulgaria for those born in the 1920s or those born in the 1940s and so on. I didn't talk about that because this is really what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to essentialize my actors based on their age because, again, also the very notion of youth applies to it's impossible to define exactly what actors meant by youth in terms of age. There were, for example, youth sections of the fascist party, to which, by the way, only the sons of full Italian citizens had access. And so some parts of, this imperial rule played with age, like age segments that in the end, also has to do with cohorts. But in most cases, they also played with ambivalence, so they talked about youth for, very young children, like 10 or 12 years old, and then also for people who were in their 30s. Again, I try to see all the nuances and the ambiguity within the terms of generations and youth when they are used by the actors, instead of you know, selecting specific cohorts. And to the follow-up that I see in the chat, I have to admit that I don't know what the impressionable years mean. Is it the years of, you know, formation? So while being a teenager, or
feel free to take the microphone, Harris, if you think
okay. Yeah, I mean, I didn't use it as an analytical tool again, but that is something that you can find in all the chapters. So basically, this is why, you know, after the chapter on politics, I approached the field of the family, because you could really see the question of upbringing. And then those who are born in the different families, they go to school and they are exposed to other forms of influence. Then after school, the question emerges what they will do to make a living. And so again, I agree in general that this, you know, this broad spectrum of youth is, you know, very crucial to be yeah, I don't know how to put it, like this impressionable individual, but again, it takes very different forms. So depending on the field you look at, the family, a sport club, school, all agree that youth is important. And I think an argument of the book is that in this particular period of time, youth really acquires a very high importance, but it doesn't lead to one single model of what youth should be.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from students or from anyone, or comments? Well, if there is none, perhaps I can just say, since we have some time, I can say, I can kind of bring into the conversation a subject which is of interest to me, that when studying these transitions in the other islands I mentioned, I thought that the major issue was always ways to preserve forms of local autonomy in different fields, in different spheres of social life, political, but also in other less political aspects, which become political, of course, within that context. And I wanted you to, it seems to me that is the case here, and you make this case, and I wanted you to discuss a little bit on this. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, another great question, because again, I would argue that, you know, this, of course, was important for Italian rulers, but even if you look at the political transformations before the end of Ottoman rule, so the last years of Ottoman rule, with the rise of the Young Turks from an oppositional movement to, you know, basically a one single party rule before World War I, you see that there were ongoing discussions about what to do with the autonomy of communities already before the colonial period. So when the Italians arrived, it's not as if they were just trying to stop time. They were part of, you know, a longer trend of transformation in the relationship between the local societies and state power. What is interesting for me is that if we focus on these two more pervasive political movements like the Young Turks and the fascists, you see that you know, the challenge that they both faced, and this is why I like to combine them in Rhodes, but it could be also at the national or imperial level, you know, as a whole, is that on the one hand, they have somehow to preserve the diversity, because this is what makes imperial rule powerful in a way, you know, from the works by Burbank and Cooper. You know, politics of difference is an essential part of any imperialist project. But at the same time, they really represent two movements that wanted to, again, pervade local societies to an unprecedented level. So compared maybe, for example, to the British authority in Cyprus, you have an additional layer of complexity because fascism did want to become the official vocabulary, the official institution for everyone in the colonies as well. But, you know, at the same time, they had to find stratagems to keep this hierarchy and diversity between colonizers and colonized, or among the different communities, upright. So again, I think it would make a case. I mean, I didn't really explore this in depth, but also to retrieve this kind of debates for the Ottoman context as well, and for the different parts of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, because then it's different if we're talking about the Arab provinces or the Anatolian core or the Balkans. And maybe one final point on this, you know, a question that I frequently try to answer because it seems to interest the readers is, why didn't you do a comparative history of the Dodecanese and Libya, since they were occupied at the same time? You know, some governors even were first in Libya and in Rhodes. The point I would try to make is that, you know, it would be a very fascinating project anyways, but that the differences in Italian colonial rule, especially the notion of race, right, that is much more clear-cut in Libya, you know, the difference between the Italians and the locals, than it is in the Dodecanese, is not only a result of Italian policies, it's also something that was already there in Ottoman times. So it's not like the Ottomans left a table, you know, of which the corners and the whole surface was equal. They also had, you know, this very different representations of power according to the setting. And this is, for me, again, is a way to decenter colonial history when we talk about the modern Mediterranean, because you can see that many pre-colonial realities have local specificities too. And maybe one last point, since it also refers to insularity. You know, there is often the idea, I don't know, I would like to hear about your approach on that, that islands are laboratories of power, you know, where governors or empires experiment with forms of rule. Although I didn't really make a big statement in the book, I think I want to go in toward another direction, because I think when we think about a laboratory, the idea is that someone is operating in a way isolated from external interference, right? So, and this is precisely in a way what the governors of Rhodes were trying to say, that they were, you know, there to mold a new generation, to create an ideal town, an ideal touristic destination, and so on and so forth. But this doesn't seem to be the case. So they were always, of course, you know, kind of disturbed in their projects. And so I don't think that any setting can be considered as a laboratory or an experiment in this exception, at least, you know, because what I try to show is really that even if you take a local setting like Rhodes, you have so many circulations and influences with from the outside that they really shape what Italian rule meant. And if you expand the view on other colonial territories, since we're talking about Libya, you know, the overall claim would be that really the whole imperial project in the Italian case also emerged from what they found in the different settings, and they were already very different, you know. So there is no this diversity remains a part of the imperial project itself.
Yeah, I agree. Although I can see islands functioning as laboratories of sovereignty, of different forms of sovereignty earlier in the century, if you think of Samos and the Principality of Samos, but also the Ionian Islands and what the Russians did there, and the British with the constitutions and everything. But of course, not in the way that governors thought about them as isolated spaces. They worked as laboratories, but also as laboratories with a huge, I mean, islands are places of connectivity and isolation at the same time, but especially connectivity. So yeah, yes. So there is another question. Did you get a sense of any figures or tropes of youth in Rhodes that were distinct from the idealized or modernizing ones? Just students, I know you mentioned troublemakers, for example.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, in many cases, troublemakers were students as well. And I wrote an article on that, precisely on school protests during Italian rule in Rhodes, in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, if you're interested. And yeah, I mean, there are many examples of what we could call deviancy. You know, it relates to moral norms, it relates to political loyalty, it relates to just, you know, the management of resources. This was very interesting for me as a researcher, and I was also allowed to delve into these basically deviant stories because, as Konstantina mentioned, I had access to this archive of the colonial police, the Carabinieri, and maybe I can say a few words on that, since it's really
of course,
about, you know,
yeah,
alternative looks on youth. So this archive basically is double-edged, so it has both you know, potential and problems, because it is incredibly detailed. So one should not just think of police archives, of course, as a criminal record archive. Anytime a resident of Rhodes or even a visitor of Rhodes had, you know, some requests, for example, a passport or opening a store or whatever, they had to go through this police bureaucracy. And what is interesting is that for everyone, the Italian police try to retrace a biography. In some cases, it's very, very detailed. In others, it's just, you know, a kind of biographic form included in the file. But this archive is a gold mine for that, because it really sheds light, again, not just on criminals, but on many aspects of everyday life. It's not just documents written by the police. There's a lot of attestations and statements and letters. So really a gold mine.
This is in Rhodes, right?
It's in Rhodes because when the Italians left, kind of in a hurry, they left it in the basement, basically, of what would become the Greek police. And it was, I wouldn't say discovered, but let's say it was valued again and opened again recently by an Italian researcher that I'm very much indebted to, Marco Clementi, who work with the local archive, the GAC, the Greek State Archive in Rhodes. And they are working, I mean, it's a very long, and I don't want to enter into the details because I know they have a little bit of delay, but the idea is to make the many of these sources also available online.
Oh,
the only let's say problem with this with these sources is that the chronological frame is very limited, because they started to produce massive sources on Rhodians in 1929, and then the archive ends. I mean, the sources become more scarce in the 40s, so during the war years. And for someone like me, who is mainly interested in this longer perspective, I mean, I really had to be careful, because otherwise the balance would have been broken. But it's also fascinating, because when they retrace the biography of the locals, they of course also refer to the Ottoman period. So it's a very interesting archive, but again, as any repository, it also invites some caution.
Of course. So we're perfectly on time, and I think it was very stimulating conversation. No, there is. Matteo is my student, so I have to read that question. So he says, "Thank you, Andrea. I'm a student attempting to write about Stella Levy, and I'm interested in exploring, among other things, why she never returned to Rhodes after immigrating to the United States. I'm hoping that a psychological and personal question might yield different historical answers about the years of youth in Rhodes. In general, I'm wondering how you balance small-scale and large approaches to historical research, and the benefits and challenges of the small-scale microhistorical approach for you. Yes, let's answer this question as the last thing because it's important.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Matteo, if you're interested, I hope when I will be in New York in April that we will have more time to talk about your very interesting research. Right now, since we only have a few minutes, I cannot enter into the very interesting, but also very...
But I can put you two in touch, so
exactly.
No
This question about small scale and large scale is very important, but you can also find some answers in the book. But yeah, I will leave it aside for now. But what is interesting is that the book ends with an epilogue that is precisely about basically what happened at the end of Italian rule, like in a good movie, you know, where you see what the characters do afterwards. And it's interesting because, again, mobility is crucial, but from another perspective, because it's very closely related to the forced displacement, the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz. Only a few survivors managed to, first of all, to survive, and then many tried to go back to Rhodes. And there is a very interesting story about this couple who was shocked when they got back to the old Jewish neighborhood and saw that nobody was living there, apart from some local families that had seized the houses, not from the Jewish community, of course. And so they were appalled by this view, and they decided to move away again. Some went to Italy and some to the United States. So again, it's a point that allows me to remind us that this second end of empire, so the end of Italian rule, again, has a lot to do with displacement. In many cases, a forced displacement. But if you look at Muslims, like many Muslims also left Rhodes, not only during World War II. They weren't specifically targeted by any measure, but life conditions were very catastrophic in Rhodes, whereas Turkey was still a neutral country, so they tried to move to Turkey legally or illegally. But then another point that maybe is a good conclusion, because it also relates to Konstantina's ongoing research. Many Muslim families left Rhodes during the Cyprus crisis of the 1960s and 70s. So again, something that is not directly related to the period of Italian rule, but that invites us to think of this long end of empire. In French, you would say sortie d'empire, that was not, sudden, it was not overnight, but really has to be studied, I would say, throughout different decades, almost to the end of the 20th century.
Yes, wonderful. A correction. It will be my future project. Now I'm working on a different. So thank you. We already convinced David to buy your book. That's wonderful. So thank you very much about all of you. Thank you so much to you. And congrats again on your wonderful book. And we hope to see you soon here in New York. I know that you're coming in April. So thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to see many friends.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the great questions, and I look forward to meeting you again in the near future. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day, all of you.
Bye-bye.